Let's talk just a little bit about informative speaking. What is informative speaking exactly? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me tell you. Informative speaking is speaking to an audience, a person, or a group to provide knowledge. That's all you're doing is sharing information and knowledge, not opinion. There are a few things that fall into the category of informative speaking, such as telling a group or a person about new things. So bringing new things to light, that's informative speaking. Maybe there's some new information on a familiar subject and you have that information. Communicating that to others would be informative speaking. Perhaps you have a unique way of looking at a subject or have a perspective that others may not take. Communicating that, giving a speech, a talk, or just sharing it would be informative speaking. And demonstrations are also informative speaking. So we do this a lot. Many things fall into it, and it's important that we know how to do it appropriately. The whole gist is that when you are speaking to inform, you're sharing knowledge and increasing that of your audience, not altering their attitudes. You want to deepen their understanding of something without changing or modifying the way they feel or think. That would be persuasive. And we'll talk about that a little later. When you are speaking to inform your audience, try to avoid impressing upon them your own opinions, your own positions. We don't really want to share with them what we think. We want to give them the facts and knowledge. Is this ever going to be useful in the real world? Absolutely. Think about class presentations. You have some for college classes right now, I'm sure. If you're watching this, I'm sure that you have some in other classes. When you are sharing the information from your research or maybe an experiment that you did in biology or chemistry, that's informative speaking. Someday you're going to go out into the workforce, right? When you do that, your boss may ask you to share with him a weekly report. So when you meet with your boss and you're sharing this weekly report, that's informative speaking. You want to be sure that you do that correctly and that you do it in a way that makes you shine, because he cuts the check, right? And you don't want him to think you're a slacker. Perhaps you work in an environment that requires you to explain situations to a client, or maybe you have to sign them in or explain some details about a contract to your client. You're informing them. So you really need to know how to do it appropriately so as to make the client happy, as well as make sure they are informed about what they're getting themselves into. What if someday you grow up and you find yourself to be an expert in your field or a top performer in your chosen career? They may ask you to give a seminar or training or a demonstration. All of those are types of informative speaking. So the tools that you are learning in this class are for more than just this class. You can use them throughout your life in different scenarios. So, in the real world, you're going to want somebody to remember what you said. Because what is the point in speaking if nobody remembers what you said? I know that in this class we don't care. Like, who cares if anybody remembers what I said in my informative speech? But it is important to understand how to motivate your audience to listen and remember what you said. Because again, these situations are going to come up later in life, and you're going to want those other people to listen and pay attention. First, it starts with a well-organized speech. Your audience will notice if you are unorganized or unfamiliar with the information. So this is where your outline is going to come into play. Have you ever talked to somebody or listened to somebody who's kind of all over the place, and maybe you gave up trying because it was so mentally taxing to follow along and try to create a cohesive narrative with them? Don't let that be you. Don't do that to your audience. Let's talk about how we'll organize our outline and our speech so that we can maintain our audience's attention as well as keep them tuned in. So, first, we're going to talk about the introduction and conclusion, because having a well-organized introduction and conclusion helps your audience follow along, and it gives them all of the tools that they need to be introduced to the topics so that when they hear them in the body, they are familiar with them, and then you'll review them in the conclusion for that last little kick. But before we go on, I do want to point out that you should always build the body of your speech before your introduction or your conclusion. If you haven't written the body of your speech, how do you know what to conclude in your introduction? How would you know what main points to preview in your introduction if you haven't written the body of your speech? You wouldn't. So start with the body of your speech. Next, you will write your introduction and then your conclusion. So, what makes an introduction great? Well, first, it's the hook, your attention getter. You want a great attention getter because this is what grabs your audience's attention from the beginning and makes them pay attention. It is super important to make sure that you are not giving away the topic of your speech. If someone stands up there and says, "Hi, my name is Amanda, and today we're going to talk about informative speaking," it's super boring. Make it exciting and give them just a little suspense. Build some curiosity there. Give them an attention getter that might hint at what your topic is, but doesn't give it away. You're also going to want to be sure you clearly preview your 3 main points, or 4 if you have them. Clearly previewing them helps your audience follow along later, as I said. This introduces them to your audience, so when they hear them in the body, they are familiar, and it helps them commit them to memory. You hear them in the preview, and then you hear them in the body, and you're like, yeah, I've heard that somewhere before, subconsciously. Sure that this should usually be the last sentence of your introduction paragraph. Be sure you are also using the same words that you will use in your main point sentences when previewing your main points. For example, if your first main point sentence is, "There are many great restaurants in Savannah. No matter how picky you are, you will find something you enjoy." In the preview, you should use the words "great restaurants," because great restaurants in the introduction, and then they hear it in the main point, and they can make that connection. You also want to be sure that your conclusion is well organized. Have you ever talked to somebody and they stopped abruptly and you were waiting for them to continue and they were like, "No, I'm done. This is my mom all the time." So don't leave your audience hanging. If they feel like you haven't wrapped up the speech and given them a conclusion, they're probably not going to have a positive feeling about the speech. People remember how you make them feel. So make sure that your conclusion is well organized and that it indicates that the speech will be ending. Another way to increase your audience's understanding is to use transitions between your main points. These transitions serve as what we call signposts. They help your audience follow along and lets them know where you are in your speech. Might be first, second, lastly. Those might be some words that you use, but you may also want to use this as a review. You see, doing this helps your audience know where you're at in anticipation of what's coming next. It keeps them from feeling lost. And if perhaps they got lost on the last point, it helps reel them back in and get them engaged again. These can also serve as great reminders throughout the speech of what's been covered and let them know what's coming next. Remember, the point is to enlighten your audience because you want them to remember, especially in the real world, not just this class. So the more they hear your key points, the more likely they are to remember them, and they will associate the supporting information with these key points when they remember it. One way that you can use them as a reminder is to say something such as, now that your tummy is full from dinner at one of those delicious restaurants I told you about, let's move on to where you will be staying. This walks your audience from main point 1, which is food, to main point 2, which is lodging. So be sure that you are aware that this can be done and that it is a great way, especially in longer speeches, to keep your audience on track and walk them through the speech. The last way that I am going to discuss keeping your audience engaged and helping them retain the information is by including well-selected presentation aids. There are all kinds of presentation aids. Back in the day, we used to actually bring in large charts or graphs, maybe an actual photo of something. But in this day and age, we can do that all right here on the computer online. But those are all great examples of presentation aids. Maybe you have a model of something. Think about architects who might bring a model of a house or a plan, or they might bring in the actual blueprints. Maybe you have an object. I once had a student who did a speech. She was from Hawaii and she was talking about Hawaii, and she actually had her mother mail her a coconut because that was one of the things she talked about that was unique to Hawaii, is you can mail a coconut in the mail without having to put it in a box. So think about what will add to your speech. What will help your audience understand? Is it a hard concept? Maybe you want to use a diagram. All of those serve to help your audience understand the information and process it. A poorly chosen presentation aid or poorly designed PowerPoint can do quite the opposite. It can distract your audience, causing them to fall off of the wagon, so to speak, and no longer be following along or listening because they're trying to figure it out. When you design a PowerPoint or any slideshow, you can incorporate those slides with graphs and diagrams or photos and maps. You can even incorporate a video or a soundbite, but make sure that they fit your presentation and that you are presenting them at the appropriate time. People often forget to advance their slides, and sometimes they even forget to start them. So putting cues such as advance slide on your speaking outline or note cards, whichever you choose to use, will serve as a reminder and it will help you along the way. Also, when you're designing your slides, don't write too much. Too many words will cause your audience to concentrate on that and kind of tune you out. You want your audience to listen to what you are saying, but be able to look at your presentation so as to supplement your words with what they are seeing. Some information that you may put up there in words might be hard to pronounce words, or maybe there's a statistic and you want to put that up there, like 10 million something, just for emphasis. So if you're trying to emphasize something, if it's a difficult word to say or spell, or perhaps it is a word that is said in a way that is different from the spelling, that would be a good one to put up there too. That will help your audience see it and recognize, I know that word. Whereas if they hear it, They may not, especially if they've been pronouncing it wrong. If it seems like you're repeating yourself a lot throughout your speech, you probably are. But that's the key. You want to repeat yourself. This is an oral presentation, and the audience doesn't have a written script or essay of what you are saying. So you need to repeat yourself to build up that memory. Repetition is key, and repetition builds memory. Think about muscle memory. If you have ever danced, you know that after you practice so many times, you just know what comes next. It builds muscle memory, just like playing the piano does. That's what we want to do throughout our speech. We want our audience to associate these words that we are saying over and over with some of the other information chunks that we are supplying to them. So in the end, your speech should inform. It should give your audience new knowledge, a new perspective, a new outlook, or explain to them how to do something. You're not changing your audience's mind, and you're not modifying their position or thoughts. You want it to be memorable, because otherwise, if they don't remember what you said, why are we talking?